Just wish to discuss several things that tie in with managerialism, and we've been on this topic for several weeks now, but I want to tie it back to the occult, the esoteric, the mystery schools going back millennia, the various cautionary tales that we see, and some of the fables, the mythologies that are cross-cultural that we bear witness to that state there is a lost paradise, or at one point in Earth's history there was perpetual summers. I believe the Greco-Romans called it a golden age, and this would be somewhat similar to the likes of, the Gan Eden or the Garden of Eden. And within this golden age, which of course was tied with Kronos or Saturn, it was called the Saturnia Regna, the kingdom of Saturn. And this idea of recreating the kingdom is something, of course, that is focal. It is central, rather, to Abrahamism and to the Abrahamic eschatology. And of course, everything that we see within the world today is to bring about this eschatology. Now, of course, this eschatology is just not necessarily Abrahamic specifically. It certainly is something that finds its way through a general thread of mysticism that I believe, again, from what I've studied and what I've glimpsed, it seems to go all the way back to this precursor civilization, this antediluvian civilization which they are now attempting to recreate. All the way down, by the way, to geoengineering. So the geoengineering that is going on, it's an attempt by them, I believe, of course a primitive attempt, to reform, to reset the climate back to how it was in the Saturnia Regna, or the kingdom of Saturn, the kingdom of Yahweh, the golden age, where there was total abundance. You didn't need farmers because it was a perpetual harvest season. This was ensured by the sort of vapour canopy around the world. This is what is known as the firmament within biblical tradition. Outside of biblical tradition, this actually stems from the Akkadian and the Sumerian mythos. And of course, this is cross-cultural. Other cultures, mythologies, had names similar to the firmament. Of course, similar meanings to the firmament, rather. Similar conceptualizations to the firmament. Therefore, there's commonality between all of these various world religions and mythologies. This is where the earth was covered by a cloudy canopy, which normalised the temperatures all over the entire surface. And moreover as well, it seems that in several mythologies, the sun appeared to rise in the west and set in the east, which is obviously contrary to what we see now. It rises in the east, sets in the west. This may tie in with what we see, for example, in the Masonic and Kabbalistic traditions, and all mystery traditions where, for example, within the Masonic tradition, we see that we're one of the secret greetings between brother Masons. I'm paraphrasing, but it goes something like this: I am a traveller coming from the east, seeking that which was lost in the west. So therefore that could tie in with that, this idea of the paradise lost. There was no winter, or a very minimal winter. And indeed as well, we even see certain points of evidence, for example, the inland seas of salt water. Lake Titicaca, the Caspian Sea, for example. This all points to that at one point in time, there was some mass deluge, that this salt water was deposited in these areas. So it's left as a source of mystery. How did that occur? Well, the only explanation, really, the only logical explanation, is that there was some deluge, mass deluge across the earth, probably caused by a tectonic movement, a tectonic shift. And we read that, for example, in Plato's work, the Timaeus, the Critias, where he discusses there was a mass deluge. He discusses Atlantis, of course. He also discusses the notion that there was fire and water. "Tell us," said the other, "the whole story, and how and from whom Solon heard this veritable tradition." He replied, "In the Egyptian delta, at the head of which the river Nile divides, there is a certain district which is called the district of Sais, and the great city of the district is also called Sais, and is the city from which King Amasis came. The citizens have a deity for their foundress. She is called in the Egyptian tongue Neith, and is asserted by them to be the same whom the Hellenes call Athene or Athena. They are great lovers of the Athenians, and say that they are in some way related to them. To this city came Solon, and was received there with great honour. He asked the priests, who were most skilful in such matters, about antiquity, and made the discovery that neither he nor any of the other Hellene knew anything worth mentioning about the times of old. On one occasion, wishing to draw them on to speak of antiquity, he began to tell about the most ancient things in our part of the world, about Phoroneos, who is called the first man, and about Niobe, and after the deluge of the survival of Deucalion and Pyrrha, and he traced back the genealogy of their descendants, and reckoning upon the days, tried to compute how many years ago the events of which he was speaking happened. Thereupon one of the priests, who was a very great age, said, O Solon, Solon, you Hellenes are never anything but children, and there is not an old man among you. Solon in return asked him what he meant. I mean to say, he replied, that in mind you are all young. There is no old opinion handed down among you by ancient tradition, nor any science which is hoary with age, and I will tell you why. There have been, and will be again, many destructions of mankind, arising out of many causes. The greatest have been brought about by the agencies of fire and water, and other lesser ones by innumerable other causes. There is a story, which even you have preserved, that once upon a time Pathon, the son of Helios, having yoked steeds in his father's chariot, because he was not able to drive them in the path of his father, burnt up all that was upon the earth, and was himself destroyed by a thunderbolt. Now this has the form of a myth, but really signifies a declination of the bodies moving in the heavens around the earth. What that's discussing is most likely the precessional year, or some other form of unexpected event which caused some form of axial tilt, some sort of axial wobble, if you will. This would naturally alter the environment upon Earth, and furthermore alter the very climate of Earth. It would send us into a fall, if you will, a descent from the Golden Age to the age that we are in now, which the Greco-Romans called the Iron Age, the lowest of all ages. Brutish, rather uncivilized, a time of war, not a time of peace or prosperity or plenty. A time where an ignoble race has taken residence upon the throne and has taken bastion within the halls of power. It continues on. And a great conflagration of things upon the earth. Fire, potentially, but he may be discussing simply a great war, I very much doubt that, of course. I think he's talking about fire, deluge, so volcanoes, a mass tsunamis, deluge across the entire earth. This is why we see all of these various deluge myths, cross-cultural in every single culture known to man that I can think of. I mean, Acadia, Sumeria, they had the Atrahasis or Atrahasis myth. Literally it means the wise man, or the wisest of men. You have the myth of Noah, of course as well, even the idea of the rainbow, which I won't get into here, but there's a very good series on that by Charles Giuliani over on his Alternative Science series, where he discusses this lost paradise and the evidence of catastrophe within our far-flung past, which reoccurs after long intervals. At such times, those who live upon the mountains and in dry and lofty places are more liable to destruction than those who dwell by rivers or on the seashore. And from this calamity, the Nile, who is our never-failing saviour, delivers and preserves us, when on the other hand, the gods purge the earth of a deluge of water. The survivors in your country are herdsmen and shepherds who dwell on the mountains. Interestingly, that's where the Amorites descended from, if you will. They were called the Boers of the mountain. They were the pastoralists. But those who, like you, live in cities are carried by the rivers into the sea. Whereas in this land, neither then nor at any other time does the water come down from above on the fields, having always a tendency to come up from below, for which reason the traditions preserved here are the most ancient. The fact is that wherever the extremity of winter, frost, or of summer does not prevent mankind exist, sometimes in greater, sometimes in lesser numbers, and whatever happened either in your country, or in ours, or in any other region of which we are informed, if there were any actions noble or great, or in any other way remarkable, they've all been written down by us of old, and are preserved in our temples. Whereas just when you and other nations are beginning to be provided with letters, and the other requisites of civilized life, after the usual interval, the stream from heaven, like a pestilence, comes pouring down and leaves only those of you who are destitute of letters and education. And so you have to begin all over again like children, and know nothing of what happened in ancient times, either among us or among yourselves. As for those genealogies of yours which you just now recounted to us, Solon, they are no better than tales of children. In the first place, you remember a single deluge only, but there were many previous ones. In the next place, you do not know that there formerly dwelt in your land the fairest and noblest race of men which ever lived, and that you and your whole city are descended from a small seed of remnant of them which survived. And this was unknown to you, because for many generations the survivors of that destruction died, leaving no written word. For there was a time, Solon, before the deluge of all, when the city which now is Athens was first in war and in every way the best governed of all cities, is said to have performed the noblest deeds and have had the fairest constitution of any which tradition tells under the face of heaven. It seems as well that in these days of yore that are unknown to us within the modern world, that there was a greater abundance of oxygen, perhaps maybe 18% higher, as a constituent part of the atmosphere. And in this sense, there would have been a greater longevity to human life and a greater stature to the human form. that was developed from there, we would have had a greater growth rate, if you will, due to the higher oxygen consumption that we would have naturally had, due to, again, as I stated, maybe 18% higher oxygen as a constituent part of the atmosphere. We have the evidence of locations of mass, fossilized remains of fish with still articulated bones. The bones of fish, of course, are mere, quite soft cartilage, and thus they typically disarticulate very rapidly upon the death of the animal. However, that is not the case if the correct conditions are met. Those correct conditions would, again on a mass scale for mass fossilized remains in specific locations, would have to be volcanic eruption, right? Pyroclastic flow. So it must have been something absolutely cataclysmic for this to have occurred and to have engendered the state of the paradise lost. So of course, we even see that with human beings. Human beings don't really seem to be, they're quite fragile, of course, they don't really seem to be well suited to the environments of the earth, be them hot or cold environments or anywhere in between, sort of temperate climates. Therefore, one could argue that human beings were the product of a different environment to the one that we have now upon Earth, the product of an entirely different age. There are other instances of evidence here that seem to indicate this precursor civilization that succumbed to some form of cataclysmic event. It may have been something to do with the precessional year, where we move axially from Polaris to Vega and vice versa. That occurs within a period of 25,920 years. This is also called the plasma reset. However, I don't want to delve into that here. I just bring it up because everything that's happening right now seems to be being done to ensure the success of this reset back into what they believe is an ancient or grander time, a utopia. So we see as well across the West that, according to statistics, on average, and this is most countries in the West, of course it's higher in some places as opposed to others. For example, Canada has the highest excess deaths on average per week. I think it's up 20% on average, again from pre-2021 data. Of course, as well in the UK it's probably higher. It's at 10% currently on average each week. However, the ONS, the National Statistic Bureau in the UK, they have altered how they measure excess death rates. So therefore, what we are getting now isn't actually accurate at all. And thus, we can only imagine the reason they have altered that is because it would be far higher and probably cause national alarm on a scale that's unmanageable for them. So therefore they just suppress the numbers. It's similar to, of course, what occurs within the US and other Western economies, where they simply, statistically manipulate things. They manipulate the job market through the creation of either low-paying or absolutely wasteful positions in the public sector and the government. And by that, they can wangle the figures, they can skew them, artificially inflate the job creation figures. And again, when you boil it all down, when you really deeply dive into, well, for instance, the US economy, the private sector has not grown. In fact, it's had a negative, a downward trajectory of I guess, negative growth, as some economists call it. Interestingly as well, there's been no rise in real GDP within the US economy. Of course, this is the same with the rest of the West. And the way it appears that statistically there is higher growth within GDP is that what is considered GDP is rather lax, and has been altered again in recent decades. So, for example, one of the primary driving forces manipulating the GDP figures within the US is government spending, because government spending, hence borrowing, is considered GDP growth according to the statistics. Therefore, if you factor that out, you have no growth within the GDP of the US. Again, in some sectors, you actually have negative growth. It's the empire is stagnating. And I want to discuss the storm that is coming, or, again, that's an acronym, STORM, Spike-Triggered Autoimmune Response Mechanism. And I think with, again, these average excess death rates, couple that with the population collapse that is approaching. I will do a video on that soon. I have about 20 pages of notes on that. Statistics, general trends that I've identified, and furthermore, just where I see everything going based on a linear projection of those population and or demographic trends going forward. Demographic, be it societal, moral, religious, all of those trends and its effect on demography. So, VAIDS, again, I can't mention what that means, or Needlecraft Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome. We'll just use that term, the Needlecraft term. The storm is coming in a surge pattern, like it is tidal as opposed to a tsunami. So it's not coming instantaneously. It's not coming in one, large sweeping, simultaneous cull. It is coming in a surge pattern, again, like a tidal wave, right? Tidal forces. If you were on a beach, the tide comes in and it goes out, in and out. This is similar to their management of crises, or cycles of crises and respite. So you will have the crises, which is the peak of hysteria, mass formation, psychosis, all of this. Then you will have the trough, right, the period of respite, and then you will continue. This is similar to what they did within MK Ultra experiments, and the way they break the subject and ensure, again, as managerialism seeks to alter the behavioural patterns of the human subject, right, to create predictable patterns of behaviour. How do you do that? You have to break down, dehumanise, like the military do, the initiate. So we are, or we have been as a species, initiated into this ritual, this cyclical ritual of torture and respite. And by immersion into this, and then respite, immersion into crises, then respite, we are building a sort of Stockholm syndrome, or many people are. Of course, the people watching this are not. We are all abnormal. We're all an anomaly within normative human patterns of behaviour. We are an anomaly. And the machine does not like anomalies. the managerialist loves predictability. It loves those well understood waveforms. It does not like those individual spikes that are unpredictable within the wave, that destroy its grand, perfect symmetry. So we are the asymmetrical factor here, and thus everything that they're doing is in an attempt to wean us out of society. Now, of course, they desire population collapse. I mean, that's what they're engendering. They've been engendering that since the 1960s, and again, my series on the population collapse will go into that. But across all Western countries, every week we're seeing a 20 to 25% increase in excess death rate, right? Again, comparative to pre-2021 levels. What's been done is absolutely irreparable. The actual trauma it's going to cause in society will fracture society. Even with this sort of tidal pattern, this, let's be plain here. The pattern that they're using, the surge pattern, or the sort of tidal-like pattern of excess deaths, of doing away with the population. It is inconspicuous, right? But it's conspicuous enough within families that everyone will know, and I myself can attest to this. Everyone will know somebody that has died from these needle crafts. And this is why they require this avian sniffles, right? Again, to use a code word, or World War III. It's to hide deaths. I stated this all the way back in 2022, when the Russo-Ukraine crises or events, flashpoint, kicked off. I could just see what was coming down the line. It's going to turn into a perpetual global conflagration, global war, and couple that with the incremental disease X's. It will ensure, they can maintain the narrative, at least to hide or conceal, to sequester the rise in surge patterns, right? Until such a point where the population can become manageable. You will also need some form of distraction. Again, the perpetual global war acts as a distraction, but only for a time, because we dwell within a hyper-reality. So people within their low attention span state require constant updates to maintain the state narrative, the regime's legitimacy, and to ensure fear is amply administered equally throughout the populace. So distractions will have to be induced. I suspect they will, crash the economy. We're already in recession. I mean, the US needs $1 trillion per day just to stay afloat. It needs to print that per day, quote, quote, print. This is something we saw during Rome and the Roman Republic, and right at the end of the Roman Republic, where the patrician class, the rich, the powerful, the senatorial class, and also, they went by several names, the Optimates, for example, and I detail this in my work Rise and Fall, where they used usury, and also the debasement of the currency, and of course inflationary pressures on pricing and everything from that, to drive down labour and to drive up the cost of living. At the same time, they were bringing in slave labour, which ensured hyper-competitiveness within the labour market of Rome and the Roman Republic at that point, but it was an empire essentially. It just did not have an imperator just quite yet. That would come with the populist Caesar. So this slave labour, these immigrants, essentially, which is the sort of euphemism, the political language that is now used for it within the West. Of course, the senatorial class, the patrician class, the rich, essentially, the elite of the society, they have Freudian slips every so often where they do call these people, or they describe them as slaves. They describe them as slaves. For example, we see one of the Osborns, I forget her first name. It's one of the daughters of Sharon and Ozzy Osbourne, I think actually is the only daughter of them, stated that we need Mexican immigrants because who would, clean our toilets and cut our grass and do the gardening for cheap, right? And furthermore as well, we had Nancy Pelosi several years back state that we need immigrants because who else would, pick the corn, and who else would pick the fruit and keep prices low? Prices aren't low because of the cost of labour. There's no problem with the cost of labour. They just want, of course, the elite want higher profits, right? But the problem is inflation. And inflation will never stop because the rich, the elite, they establish and grow their wealth on inflation. The greater the inflation, the more wealth that they generate, garner, and the more they buy up the land. And we saw that within Rome, as stated, that they were driving down the cost of labour, right, or undervaluing labour through inflation, at the same time driving up the cost of living for basic goods, necessities to life and everything. This was driving the rural workers into the cities because that was where the high-paying jobs were. I mean, does this sound similar to our situation? And at the same time, this, aristocratic landed gentry, this patrician class, the optimists was another name for them, they owned the land in the city too. They owned the houses, and they drove up all of the pricing on the rents. And what that did was ensure that these labourers, these formerly rural labourers that were now in the cities, had to take out usurious loans, and the creditors of these loans were, you guessed it, the patrician class of Rome, the senatorial class. So thus, essentially, they enslaved through usury, through debasement of the currency, through inflation, and of course, primarily through the hyper-competition posed by slave labour, what we would now call immigration. It's a sort of euphemism, essentially, for slavery. It is political language to soften the blow of calling it what it actually is. I mean, these people are not brought in to the nations within the West because they want to provide them a high standard of living, the elite, that is. They bring them in because they damn well know it will saturate the labour market, and if these people desire less money, less wages for their work, it will artificially ensure that wages across the board are dampened, are mitigated. That keeps the social order. This is why taxation and all of this, all of these monetary pressures, all of these inflationary pressures on the worker is maintained. It will never be lessened. It will never be ameliorated by the political class, because that is how they maintain social order. That is why I've been stating for years now that they don't care about profits, they care about power, right? It's about power. So of course, one cannot compete with slave labour. The cost of living, coupled with the devaluing of their labour through, yes, inflationary pressures and, of course, the hyper-competition within the labour market caused by, for example, within the 60s onwards, the sort of gender equality that the quote-unquote gender equality that we saw, and furthermore as well, through immigration, through the mass influx of slave labour, the exploitation of foreign youth. They don't care about your skills, they care about the cost of the labour, which inevitably translates into maintaining the social order. And of course, as I stated within my Rise and Fall book in 2021, we're going into a Thucydides trap with China and Russia. That's the narrative that's playing out. It provides the justification for a militarisation of NATO foreign policy, and by this they can begin to militarise the populace. Now, I suspect they want an artificial collapse, but this is going to be simultaneous across the globe, right? Across Earth. The species will be immersed into this global reset, and by 2030, I think you will see the emergence of some sort of global managerialist regime that is interconnected. You know, the idea of the nation state will be done away with. This will come off the back of some sort of major war, a conflagration. We even see this within Burnham's work, the 1941 work, the Managerialist Revolution, and of course Orwell borrowed heavily from that when he was writing 1984. Burnham, within that work, the Managerialist Revolution, actually states that the end of the revolution, the conclusion of it, there would be a perpetual war between three super states, power blocks, superpower blocks, if you will. Of course, in 1984, we had East Asia, we had Oceania and Eurasia. And we see the same thing develop today. You have the BRICS nations, then you have NATO, right? Or that is Oceania and East Asia, Eurasia. And then eventually in 1984, the world of 1984, East Asia, which was formerly part of Eurasia, breaks off from Eurasia. And again, you're seeing the same thing. It's playing out like some sort of script. It is like we're going through the preamble, the preface to 1984, the prequel. We're living the prequel of it. So yes, this is why they need the perpetual world war and the new avian sniffle, or the disease X. It is to ensure that these needlecraft deaths remain hidden to the general populace, because once the general populace, once the bulwark of unresisting automaton lemmings breaks, once the dam breaks, once the illusion is pierced, once the apocalypse, the revelation comes, then, to these people of course, then there's nothing legitimizing the system anymore. And the managerialist state already has a legitimacy problem. It has no ideology behind it, other than, of course, sort of woke ideology, which is, again, a vocal minority. It's at the most. But not everything is doom and gloom. So for the minority who will survive this, I think that this crime was probably one of the best things that could have happened. And I'm going to mention a comment that states why this was a good thing. And it has 3 primary points. Quote, "It gave us the kick up the arse we needed as we were bumbling along the road to slavedom and blissful ignorance, or we were just gradually making our way to global communism. Number 2, it is getting rid of a heck of a load of the dumb sheep that support and defend the government. Number 3, the demons in flesh suits showed their hand. So now every time that they attempt to pull this sort of contagion narrative, global contagion narrative, they will simply look more and more illegitimate in the eyes of people, unquote. So what we see with the people who took the needlecraft, who went through that transubstantiation ritual and took the leap of faith, right? Again, to sort of borrow some terms from Thomas Sheridan, this is in regards to a comment that I made on a Facebook post. Again, this was somebody getting the needlecraft and saying that they've had no reactions, they got a double needlecraft, so on and so forth. One of the comments had a fingers crossed emoji in it when they were discussing quote-quote reactions and quote-quote getting a double sniffle and crown sniffle needlecraft, unquote. Sorry, I have to use code here. They are taking leaps of faith, trying to prove that their trust in the government was well placed. Evidently, it is not. These people are so desperate to stay in the illusion of Pleasantville that they are gladly lining up to die. They just want to quote-quote get back to normal. So they opt for self-liquidation. And they hope, again, the fingers crossed cult, hope that the government have their best interests at heart. As we're seeing now, they do not. J. Edgar Hoover, 1956, he stated, quote, "The individual comes face to face with a conspiracy so monstrous he cannot believe it exists. The American mind has not come to a realization of the evil which has been introduced into our midst. It rejects even the assumption that human creatures could espouse a philosophy which must ultimately destroy all that is good and decent," unquote. Of course, the philosophy that they're talking about is the philosophy which I detailed to a great extent, by the way, in my new book, Yahweh is Satan, The Genesis of a New Order of the Ages. You can get that from my Lulu store page. It's very high quality, and it's 394 pages. I mean, it doesn't just deal with Yahweh being Satan. It deals with the biblical New World Order, right? I know that will be absolutely controversial to many. Again, I use biblical sources. It's a biblical commentary, actually, the first half of the book. After that, it goes into how that ties into Kabbalah, the esoteric, the coming aeon or age of Aquarius. Aquarius is obviously under the planetary sign of Saturn, so it ties it back in with the Malkut, or the kingdom, discussed within Abrahamic eschatology, and also the Saturnia Regna, the kingdom of Saturn, as we would know it. In the reinstating of this newly crowned system that seeks to emulate the precursor civilization and the precursor state. Again, all the way down to geoengineering. And what better way to bring this in? The principle of kingship, the first king, Saturn, or Kronos, or Yahweh. The first king, and this has been brought in, and this entire age has been anointed by the Corona event, which in Latin means crown. And of course the other word, the V word, ends with an S and it has an R in it, right? It's not the needlecraft word. That in Latin means poison, so therefore the entire thing put together means the poison of the crown, right? The poison of Saturn, the poison of Kronos. You go to the UN building within the meditation room, you have this sort of chaotic, modern art installation. Then right in front of it, you have this black, monolithic cube, which that is the symbol of Saturn. The centre of the hexagram also forms a cube. That is the symbol of the material, right? The symbol of the god of this world, which is Satan, who also goes by the name Yahweh. Again, fairly controversial, a fairly polemical statement to make, but I can assure you, my book, Yahweh is Satan, links for it will be in the description. Read that. If you're still unconvinced, I will give you your money back. Right? Money back guarantee. I have over 500. There's over 100 footnotes or citations throughout the entire book, which is 394 pages long, but just within the section on the biblical commentary, discussing the biblical New World Order and, again, Yahweh being Satan, it has over 500 biblical quotes from the canonical texts, right? I don't use any apocryphal works. This is all from the canonical texts. I could use apocryphal works, I could use the Talmud, I could use the Book of Jubilees, all of the sort of Old Testament apocrypha. I could use, for instance, the Zohar, the Kabbalah. I don't. I rely solely on the Tanakh, primarily the Torah, the Deuteronomical histories as well, and also the New Testament, the canonical New Testament. And just using that, just reading it as is, and picking out the quotes, providing the context, because I know that that's a bit of a stickler when it comes to people that are attempting to defend the Bible, to defend Yahweh and Yeshua HaMashiach and all of this. I know that's something they use as a sort of get out of jail card. It's similar to the panacea of God works in mysterious ways and all of this. You read that book, you will be absolutely convinced that Yahweh is Satan. And I also include some of the work of David Litwa. I reference his work from his book, The Evil Creator. And within that work, some other books that he's done as well, he discusses Yahweh being linked to Set. This links him to the Hyksos, which is the pre-Israelites who conquered Egypt, northern Egypt, and established a dynasty there. And that appears within the story of Joseph becoming the vizier of Egypt, and then he invites his father, the patriarch Jacob, who was renamed Israel. He invited his father there. In the records, Jacob is called Seletus, right? Which is probably not a name. I detail it in Yahweh as Satan, but the etymology of that name, it means like the leader of a war band. That's literally what it means, or the leader of the host, which is, funnily enough, what Yahweh is called. Yahweh Seviot is one of the titles of Yahweh, which literally means Yahweh, Lord of the Hosts. And of course, that name was later altered into Sabazios. Seviot became Sabazios. Yahweh Seviot became Jupiter Sabazios, or Zeus Sabaoth, or in Anatolia it became Jove or Jove Sabaoth or Sabazios, depending upon the locality. So yes, and of course the Hyksos trace back, as I stated in my book Blood on the Sand, it traces back to the Amorites, who took over through subterfuge and subversion, and breeding essentially demographic warfare, breeding out the Akkadians through immigration. They took over the Akkadian Empire, and then a couple of hundred years later, they had entirely assimilated the Neo-Sumerian Empire. That is at the point where we see Abraham of Ur, because by that point, around about 1700 BC, well, 1750 BC or so, had been demographically altered by the Amorites. They had totally assimilated it demographically. They had bred out the native Sumerian and Mesopotamian populations there. They had Semitized them, if you will. And of course, they seem to be doing the same right now. It is called a circular business cycle. It is how biotech as an asset class maintains its profitability. It is not done through curing the masses, but by poisoning them under the guise of administering them the cure. The Frankenfood industry is the same. It is called slavery. Demons get off on torture. Plus, how many are selling their homes due to this? Due to the high medical costs from being maimed by the needlecraft. It is a great big land grab, which is again what of course we saw at the end of the Roman Republic, this monopolization of land. When an entire family dies, doesn't the government kindly step in and take it all? Remember, you're going to rent everything and be happy. And recently as well, just on the afternoon of the general election in the UK on July the 4th, there was released a government document which quietly admitted a needlecraft holodomor in which millions of children have been maimed and murdered. So of course it was released on the election day because they believed that this story would be buried under the mountain of election coverage. And of course that is exactly what happened. While people were busy voting out WF Stooge, Rishi Sunak, who wears the blue tie, in favour of WF Stooge Keir Starmer, who wears the red tie, the government was desperately trying to keep this devastating story, this government document, about the enormous number of children they have killed and maimed under wraps. And of course the complicit media went right along with it. Obviously I'll blur out the sensitive wording here and there, just so it can get past the censoriousness of the YouTube algorithm. But as you can see here, those who had 3 needlecrafts, there was 247,730 who died from non-sniffle related morbidity. Of all deaths, it was almost 300,000. Of those who had 2, it was 97,000. This is just between the 1st of January 2021 to the 31st of May 2022. This is just for children aged 10 to 14. Absolutely insane, and that is from the Office for National Statistics, the ONS, as we made mention of. It's demographic warfare, folks, and it's at your doorstep right now.